sign that order of protection. Zach Holly is not the boy's biological father. Now, she filed the protection order last week. In it, she says Holly's been calling her from jail multiple times a day since his arrest. She says she has told Zach Holly that she wants him to leave her and her son alone, and that, quote, we wanted nothing to do with him, end quote. In that court document, she says she's received multiple letters from Holly and that members of Zach Holly's family are contacting her on his behalf. Now, Holly remains in the Benton County Jail where he faces capital murder, rape, burglary, and kidnapping charges in the death of 6-year-old.
Southeast A Street sits in a part of Bentonville, Arkansas, where the lawns are small but kept neat, where neighbors park their trucks along the curb, and kids leave bicycles on front porches without a second thought. It is the kind of street where everyone knows who lives where the sound of a screen door closing carries from one house to the next. The homes here are modest, single-story, close together. So close, in fact, that standing on one front porch, you could have a conversation with someone standing on the next without raising your voice. At the far end of the block, past a row of lived-in homes with toys scattered in the yards and porch lights left on through the night, there sat a house that no one lived in anymore. 704 Southeast A Street, a vacant property, no locks on the doors, no lights behind the windows. The kind of place neighbors stopped noticing a long time ago. Just part of the scenery, slowly folding into itself. In November of 2012, that house became the center of a crime scene. A 6-year-old girl was carried out of her own bed in the middle of the night, taken from a home where she should have been safe by someone she trusted completely. She was brought to that vacant house just 2 doors away, less than 100 feet from where her mother slept. By sunrise, every police unit in Bentonville had converged on this street. By midday, the national media had arrived, and by the end of the week, a man who had stood among the concerned neighbors, offering help, answering questions, appearing shaken, would be exposed for what he had done. This is the story of Jersey Bridgeman. And it begins long before that November morning. Jersey Bridgeman came into the world already facing odds that no child should have to understand. Born into a fractured household in Rogers, Arkansas, a city just 15 minutes south of Bentonville, her earliest years were shaped by instability, neglect, and eventually something far worse. Her father, David Bridgeman, and his wife, Janet Bridgeman, were the kind of people who kept their doors closed and their curtains drawn. To the outside world, the household appeared unremarkable. But behind those walls, a pattern of cruelty had taken root, one that escalated slowly, deliberately, and without intervention for far too long. Jersey was not the only child in the home, but she bore a disproportionate share of the punishment. What David and Jana called discipline had nothing to do with parenting. It was control, systematic, physical, and degrading. By the fall of 2011, the abuse had reached a level that defied comprehension. In December of that year, officers from the Rogers Police Department responded to a report concerning the welfare of children inside the Bridgeman residence. What they found when they entered that home would stay with every officer involved for the rest of their careers. Detective Larry Taylor was among the first to document the scene. Inside a small, dimly lit room, Jersey was found restrained, a chain fastened around her small frame, attached to a dog collar around her neck. She had been tethered like an animal. The reason, according to David and Jana, was that Jersey had been getting out of bed at night to take food from the kitchen. A child, hungry in her own home, punished not with words, not even with conventional discipline, but with a chain and a collar designed for a dog. Now, if you're watching this and that image sits heavy with you, it should. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Whether it's a small town like Bentonville or a city halfway across the country. I want to know who's here for Jersey's story. Every comment matters more than you think. Detective Taylor's report detailed more than just the restraint. There were signs of prolonged malnourishment, bruising in various stages of healing, on indicators that the abuse had not been a single incident, but an ongoing campaign of harm carried out over months, possibly longer. The children in that home had been living in conditions that no child should ever have to endure, and Jersey had absorbed the worst of it. Both David and Jana Bridgeman were arrested and charged with multiple counts related to the abuse. The legal process moved forward with a weight that reflected the severity of what had been uncovered. Both adults were ultimately convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, sentences that ensured neither would have access to Jersey or any other child for a very long time. Their parental rights were terminated, permanently. And here is where the system stepped in, imperfectly as it often does, but with the intention of giving Jersey a second chance. When a child is removed from an abusive household following parental arrest, the process of determining placement is neither instant nor simple. Child Protective Services, CPS, initiates what is known as a custody evaluation. The goal is to identify the most suitable and stable environment for the child, prioritizing biological relatives when possible. In Jersey's case, her biological mother, Desiree Bridgeman, had been living separately from David. She had not been part of the abusive household. When CPS conducted their assessment, Desiree was evaluated on several criteria: her living situation, her employment stability, her willingness to engage with support services, and critically, her existing relationship with Jersey. What many people do not realize is that CPS placement decisions carry enormous weight and enormous risk. Caseworkers are often managing dozens of files simultaneously. Home studies are conducted under time pressure. Follow-up visits are scheduled but not always consistent. The system is designed to protect children, but it operates within the constraints of limited funding, high caseloads, and imperfect information. For Jersey, the outcome of that process was a transfer of custody to Desiree. On paper, it was the right call. Desiree was her biological mother. She had no criminal history. She wanted her daughter back. And Jersey, despite everything she had been through, wanted to be with her mom. But what the system could not account for, what no checklist or home visit could predict, was what would be waiting in the neighborhood where Desiree chose to rebuild. That is not a failure unique to this case. It is a structural limitation built into every child welfare system in the country. CPS can evaluate a home, they can assess a parent, but they cannot vet every neighbor, every friend, every person who will eventually earn a family's trust through proximity and routine. Jersey Bridgeman had survived the worst kind of childhood abuse. She had been rescued by law enforcement, processed through the legal system, and placed into what was determined to be a safe and loving home. She was 6 years old, and for the first time in her life, things were supposed to get better. If you believe that stories like this one deserve to be told with honesty and with care, not for clicks, not for shock value, but because these children deserve to be remembered, then subscribing to this channel is one way to make sure that happens. It costs nothing, and it means everything for the reach of this work. In the early months of 2012, Desiree Bridgeman packed what she could and moved her daughters to Bentonville. It was not a dramatic relocation. There was no fanfare, no grand plan. It was a mother doing what mothers do when the ground beneath them has been torn apart. She found new ground, a small house on Southeast A Street, affordable, quiet, close enough to work, close enough to a good school. That was enough. Desiree took a job at a local convenience store, the kind of work that does not come with flexibility or forgiveness. Early shifts, late shifts, overnight shifts. The schedule rotated depending on the week, and she took whatever hours were available because the bills did not rotate. They came every month, on time, without exception. It was not the life she had imagined for herself or her girls, but it was stable. It was hers. And for the first time in a long time, it was moving in the right direction. Jersey started at Sugar Creek Elementary School that spring, and something remarkable began to happen. The girl who had been chained inside a dark room in Rogers, who had been starved for taking food in her own home, began to open up. Not all at once, not overnight, but gradually in the way that children do when they finally feel safe enough to stop bracing for the next bad thing. Her teachers noticed it first. Jersey was affectionate. She hugged freely. She smiled wide and often. She was the kind of student who wanted to help, who would pick up crayons off the floor without being asked, who would sit next to the kid eating lunch alone. And there was a warmth to her that should not have survived what she had been through, but somehow it did. She adored her younger sister. The two of them were close in the way that siblings who have shared hard things tend to be. Not just playmates, but protectors of each other. Jersey, despite being so young herself, carried a quiet sense of responsibility for her sister that went beyond her years. And there was a phrase she repeated often: to her mother, to her teachers, to anyone who showed her kindness. "I love you to the moon and back." She said it like she meant it every single time, and everyone who heard it believed her. Desiree, meanwhile, was doing everything she could to hold the structure together. Working long hours meant she needed help with childcare. Not a luxury, but a necessity. Because she could not afford professional daycare. She did not have family nearby. She relied on what most working parents in her situation rely on: the people closest to her, the people she saw every day, the people who offered, and the people closest to her lived right next door. What's the weather like where you are right now? It's a simple question, but I ask because I want to know who's here. Whether you're watching this on a cold night or a quiet afternoon, drop it in the comments. This community grows every single week because of people like you, and I never take that for granted. By the summer of 2012, Jersey Bridgeman had something she had never really had before: a home that felt like a home, a school where she belonged, a mother who was present and trying, a sister she loved fiercely, and next door, a family that felt like an extension of her own. That family was the Hollies. Amanda Holly and her husband, Zachary Dwayne Holly, lived in the house immediately next to Desiree's on Southeast A Street. They had children of their own. They kept their yard in order. They were present in the way that good neighbors are: visible, approachable, and consistent. The relationship between the two households did not begin with any formal introduction or deliberate arrangement. It grew the way most neighborly bonds do: organically. The children found each other first. A ball tossed over the low fence between the yards. A game of tag that started on one porch and ended on the other. The kind of unstructured, unsupervised play that happens on streets like Southeast A Street every single day in every small town across America. The adults followed. A wave from the driveway became a short conversation. When a short conversation became a shared meal became an open-door understanding. The kind where you stop knocking before you walk in. For Desiree, the Hollies were more than neighbors. They were relief. With her work schedule pulling her in every direction, having a family next door who was willing to watch the girls was not just convenient, it was essential. Amanda was home often. The children got along. And Zachary, he was friendly, attentive. The kind of man who would carry groceries in without being asked. The kind of man who remembered the girls' names and asked about their day. Jersey called him Uncle Zach, not because anyone told her to, not because there was a formal relationship. She called him that because, in her world, that is what safe men who were close to your family were called. Uncle. It was a word that carried trust inside it. A word that meant, this person is allowed to be near me. And no one corrected her, because no one had any reason to. Now, this is where it becomes important to understand something about the way these crimes unfold. Not in the way television presents them, with strangers in dark alleys and obvious warning signs that everyone ignores. The reality, supported by decades of research in behavioral psychology, is far more uncomfortable. According to the United States Department of Justice, approximately 93% of child sexual abuse victims know their abuser. The offender is not a stranger. The offender is a family member, a coach, a teacher, a babysitter, a neighbor. Someone who has been granted access, not through force, but through familiarity. What behavioral psychologists refer to this as proximity-based trust exploitation. It does not always involve a long, calculated grooming strategy. Sometimes it is far simpler and far more difficult to detect. The offender is already embedded in the daily routine. They are already trusted. They do not need to manufacture access. Access has been handed to them through the ordinary mechanics of community life. This is not about blaming the parent. This is not about suggesting that Desiree Bridgeman failed her daughter. She did what millions of working parents across this country do every single day. She trusted the people around her. She trusted the people who showed up. She trusted the people who were kind to her children. The failure is not in the trust. The failure is in the assumption, shared by nearly everyone, that proximity equals safety. That the person next door, the person who shares your meals and watches your kids and carries your daughter to bed, could not possibly be the person who would harm her. That assumption is not naivety, it is human, and it is exactly what offenders in these cases depend on. If you're watching this right now and you've ever left your child with a neighbor, a friend, a family member, this is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to inform you, because understanding how these dynamics work is the first step in recognizing when something is wrong, even when everything on the surface looks right. Here's what I want you to think about as we move forward. The distance between the Bridgeman front door and the Holly front door was less than 30 feet. Jersey crossed that distance almost every day. She crossed it laughing. She crossed it holding her sister's hand. She crossed it because she felt safe. And for months, she was safe. The Hollys babysat regularly. The arrangement worked. Desiree could go to work knowing her girls were next door with people who cared about them. The children played together. They ate together. They fell asleep on the same couch watching cartoons. It was ordinary. It was functional. It was everything a struggling single mother could have hoped for. And it held all the way through the spring, the summer, and into the fall of 2012, until the night of November the 19th. November the 19th, 2012, was a Monday. The kind of unremarkable weekday that leaves no impression on anyone who lives through it. The temperature in Bentonville had dropped into the low 40s by evening. The streets were quiet. Porch lights clicked on one by one as the sun went down. Desiree Bridgeman was scheduled to work a late shift at the convenience store that night. It was not unusual. She had worked these hours before, many times. The routine was familiar. Feed the girls, get them ready, walk them next door. That evening, she brought Jersey and her younger sister to the Holly home before heading out. Amanda was there. Zachary was there. The children settled in the way they always did, easily without fuss. There was nothing about that handoff that felt different from any other night. No hesitation, no instinct pulling at the edges. And just a mother leaving her daughters with people she trusted, the same way she had done dozens of times before. Desiree went to work. The hours passed. The girls played. They ate. Eventually, they fell asleep. The way children do when they are comfortable in a place, when the couch feels familiar and the sounds of the house are ones they recognize. Desiree's shift ended late. She returned to Southeast A Street sometime around 11 p.m. When she arrived at the Holly home to collect her daughters, both girls were asleep. There was no disturbance, no indication that anything was wrong. Zachary offered to help. He picked Jersey up, carefully, gently, the way someone carries a sleeping child when they do not want to wake them, and walked her next door. He entered the Bridgeman home, carried her to her bed, and laid her down. When then he left, Desiree locked up, checked on the girls, went to bed herself. The house was still. The street was dark. Everything was exactly as it should have been. For a few hours, it stayed that way. Investigators would later reconstruct what happened next using physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the layout of the street itself. What they believe, based on the totality of that evidence, is that sometime after midnight, Zachary Dwayne Holly left his own home and walked back to the Bridgeman residence. He did not force entry. The home showed no signs of a break-in, no shattered glass, no damaged locks, no pried window frames. Whether a door was left unlocked or whether Holly had knowledge of another way in remains a detail that investigators examine closely. But the result was the same. When he entered the home without waking Desiree, he entered without waking Jersey's younger sister, and he removed Jersey from her bed. A 6-year-old girl asleep in her own home, in the room where her mother had tucked her in just hours earlier, was lifted out of that bed and carried into the night by the man she called Uncle Zach. If you've been watching this from the beginning, I want to pause here and say something directly. If this story has meant something to you so far, if you believe that Jersey's name deserves to be spoken with respect and not just used for content, then hitting that like button right now is one small way to make sure this video reaches more people. It is a small thing, but for a channel like this, it changes everything. On the distance from the Bridgeman home to 704 Southeast A Street, the vacant property 2 doors down, was less than 100 feet. At night, with no streetlights illuminating that stretch of the block, the walk would have taken less than 30 seconds. No one saw it. No one heard it. The street offered no witnesses and no resistance. 704 had been vacant for some time. The property was not secured, the doors were accessible, the windows were intact, but the house was empty. No furniture, no occupants, no reason for anyone to look inside. It was the kind of property that exists in every neighborhood, present but invisible, noticed only when something forces you to notice it. Holly brought Jersey inside that house. What happened next is something this script will not describe in detail. Not because the facts are unavailable, but because Jersey Bridgeman was a 6-year-old child, and the specifics of what was done to her served no purpose beyond spectacle. What can be said, what the evidence confirmed, is that Jersey was sexually assaulted and killed inside that vacant home. Her death was not accidental. It was not the result of panic or an attempt to conceal a lesser crime. It was deliberate. She was found the following morning inside a bedroom closet. The man who carried her to bed that night, who had earned her trust, her mother's trust, and the trust of the entire street, had carried her to her death less than 2 hours later. And by the time the sun came up on November the 20th, he was already preparing to play the role of the concerned neighbor. In the hours after Jersey's body was discovered, Southeast A Street transformed into something its residents had never seen before. News vans from local affiliates arrived first, then the regional outlets. By midday, satellite trucks lined the surrounding blocks and reporters stood in front of cameras, delivering updates from the sidewalk. The vacant house visible just over their shoulders. The community responded the way small communities do when violence arrives without warning. Neighbors gathered in clusters. Parents pulled their children indoors. Conversations dropped to whispers. There was fear, real, immediate fear, because no one yet knew who had done this. No one knew if the person responsible was still nearby. And in the middle of all of it, Zachary Holly was present. He did not hide. He did not leave. He stood among the neighbors, arms crossed or hands in his pockets, watching the same scene everyone else was watching. He spoke to other residents. He expressed concern. He shook his head the way people do when they cannot believe what is happening around them. When officers began conducting door-to-door interviews, standard procedure in any homicide investigation, particularly one involving a child found within the immediate vicinity of her own home, Zachary cooperated fully. He answered questions. He provided a detailed account of the previous evening. He confirmed that he had babysat the girls. He confirmed that he had carried Jersey home and placed her in bed. He confirmed the approximate time. He offered all of this without hesitation. And then he did something that, on the surface, appeared to be the act of a man with nothing to hide. He voluntarily submitted a DNA sample. No attorney present, no request for legal counsel, no negotiation. He simply agreed. Swab taken, sample collected. The kind of cooperation that, in the early hours of an investigation, can make a person appear transparent, even trustworthy. But detectives are trained to look beyond cooperation. They are trained to observe not just what a person says, but how they say it, the rhythm of their answers, the consistency of their details, the places where a story flows naturally and the places where it feels rehearsed. And something about Zachary Holly's demeanor began to register with the investigators working the case. It was not a single thing. It was not a dramatic slip or an obvious contradiction. It was subtler than that. Where the calm was too even, the concern was too measured. He asked questions about the investigation, but the questions felt less like grief and more like reconnaissance. He wanted to know what had been found. He wanted to know where the investigation was heading. He positioned himself close to the activity, not on the periphery where most shaken neighbors tend to stand, but near the center where information was moving. None of this was evidence. None of it was probable cause. It was instinct, the kind that experienced detectives develop after years of sitting across from people who are hiding something. A feeling that the man cooperating the most might be the man with the most to conceal. What detectives did not yet know, what would not surface for several more days, was that Zachary Holly's DNA would connect to something far beyond Southeast A Street. A link that would stretch the scope of this investigation wider than anyone in Bentonville had anticipated. A connection that would reframe everything they thought they understood about the man next door. But that revelation was still coming. And in the meantime, Zachary Holly remained exactly where he had been all along, right there on the street, watching, waiting, and saying all the right things. If you haven't already, share this video with someone who follows true crime. Not the sensationalized kind, but the kind that treats these cases and these victims with the seriousness they deserve. Where Jersey's story deserves to reach further than this algorithm will carry it on its own. Sharing it is how that happens. While Zachary Holly stood on the street performing the role of the concerned neighbor, the real work was happening inside 704 Southeast A Street, behind the yellow tape, behind the closed doors, in the rooms where forensic technicians move slowly and deliberately through every inch of that vacant house. Crime scene processing in a child homicide case is meticulous by necessity. Every surface is examined, every point of contact is documented. Photographs are taken from multiple angles before anything is touched or collected. The goal is not speed, it is completeness. Because once a scene is released, it cannot be reconstructed. Whatever is missed in those first hours is often missed forever. And inside the vacant house, technicians collected biological evidence from multiple locations. Swabs were taken from surfaces, from the floor, from the closet where Jersey had been found. Fingerprints were lifted where possible. The entry points of the home were examined for trace evidence. Fibers, hair, skin cells, anything that could place a specific individual inside that property. The house itself told part of the story. There were indicators of the path taken through the home, which doors had been opened, which rooms had been entered, where the activity had been concentrated. The layout was small and simple. There were not many places to go. Whoever had brought Jersey into that house had moved with familiarity, not the hesitation of someone entering an unfamiliar space for the first time. That detail mattered, and it suggested that the person responsible had been inside 704 before, had walked those rooms before, knew the layout, knew which bedroom was in the back, knew where the closet was. And who would know the interior of a vacant house on a street like this? Not a stranger passing through, not someone from another part of town, someone local, someone who had lived on this block long enough to know which properties were empty and which doors were unlocked. The evidence collected from the scene was packaged, sealed, and sent to the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory for processing. DNA analysis, particularly in cases involving sexual assault, follows a strict chain of custody. Every sample is logged, every transfer is documented, every hand that touches the evidence is recorded. This is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is the architecture of a prosecution. Because if the evidence cannot be traced cleanly from the crime scene to the courtroom, it can be challenged. And in a case like this, no one was willing to leave that door open. At this point in the investigation, detectives had Zachary Holly's voluntary DNA sample sitting alongside the biological evidence recovered from the scene. The comparison had not yet been completed. Lab results take time, days, sometimes longer, depending on the backlog and the complexity of the samples. But the clock was moving. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing residents along Southeast A Street. They reconstructed the timeline of November the 19th into the early hours of the 20th. They mapped who was home, who was awake, who saw or heard anything, even something small, but even something that seemed insignificant at the time. And as those interviews accumulated, the picture began to tighten, not dramatically, not with a single revelation, but incrementally, the way investigations actually work when they are done correctly. One detail confirming another, one timeline overlapping with the next, one set of facts quietly narrowing the field until the circle of possibility became very, very small. At this point in the investigation, detectives were leading this case. What would your next move be? If you had the voluntary DNA, the crime scene evidence, and a cooperating neighbor whose story was almost too smooth, what would you be looking at? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and some of you have sharper instincts than you realize. Before the DNA results came back, before the arrest, before the courtroom proceedings and the headlines and the legal arguments that would follow, there was a little girl who liked to say, "I love you to the moon and back." That is where this story has to return. Not to the crime scene, not to the vacant house, not to the man who stood on the street pretending he did not know what had happened inside it, but to Jersey. Jersey Bridgeman was 6 years old. She had already survived more in those 6 years than most people endure in a lifetime. She had been chained in a dark room by the people who were supposed to protect her. She had been rescued from that room. She had been given a second chance, a new home, a new school, a mother who was fighting every day to build something stable and safe. And she was thriving. That is the part that stays with you. Why, not just that she survived the abuse in Rogers, but that she came out of it still capable of love, still capable of trust, still the kind of child who hugged her teachers and looked after her little sister and said those words out of the moon and back, like she had an unlimited supply of affection that nothing could drain. The community of Bentonville felt her loss in a way that went beyond the usual shock of a local tragedy. Vigils were held. Candles were lit along Southeast A Street. Neighbors who had watched Jersey play in the yard just days earlier stood together in the cold and tried to make sense of something that would never make sense. For Desiree, the grief was compounded by a betrayal so intimate it defied processing. The man she had trusted with her children, the man her daughter had called Uncle Zach, had taken Jersey from her bed and ended her life less than 100 feet from where Desiree slept. That is not just loss. That is a destruction of every assumption a person holds about safety, about judgment, about the people they allow into their world. And yet, as this investigation would soon reveal, what happened on Southeast A Street may not have been an isolated act. The DNA evidence that was still being processed at the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory would eventually point in a direction that no one in Bentonville had anticipated. A direction that would expand this case beyond a single street, beyond a single night, and into territory that would challenge investigators in ways they had not yet imagined. While that part of the story is still ahead, Jersey Bridgeman was 6 years old. She deserved better than what she was given, in her first home and in her last. She deserved the life that was just beginning to take shape, the one with the school she loved and the sister she protected and the mother who was trying so hard to get it right. She deserved to grow up. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What part of this story stayed with you the most? And do you want a full deep dive into the DNA evidence, the arrest, and what investigators uncovered next? Let me know in the comments. And if Jersey's story moved you, if you believe she deserves to be remembered, not as a case file, but as a child who was loved, then subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for her, for every story like hers that still needs to be told.